So let me just. So this is kind of my point of view, and it's not necessarily FHIR's point of view. If you look at the FHIR standard, the FHIR standard in many cases doesn't really consider implementation at scale. So in my relationship with FHIR over the many years I've had one, I've often gone back from an energy digital point of view and said, well, what about this, what about that? Because it's quite often the case that many people using FHIR are using FHIR in quite a localized scenario. So they might be building a single product on it. They might be building a product only within their organization for it. There are actually very few people at this point in time who are building nationwide systems. People are beginning to do that, and even when you look in the US and you look at the US and you think, oh, the stuff that they've gone about, Argonaut and other initiatives across there, yes, they are building things to be used nationwide, but they're not being deployed nationwide. So much of the stuff that the US has built in FHIR has yet to be deployed at scale. And even though, on the Argonaut profiles per se, then, a lot of implementers are now beginning to surface those in their products, are not being used politically. So I think, as far as FHIR goes, there's still not a great evidence base on lots of things that FHIR offers when it comes to deploying things at scale. So this is kind of probably teaching you guys to suck eggs, but as far as structure definitions, and which are kind of what profiles mainly are in FHIR, the whole purpose of putting something into a structure definition or a profile is for computational, to make it the rules within that computationally accessible. And the primary reason for that is to drive things like validation. So you can use it to document what's in a profile, but you can use a PDF file, you can use Markdown, you can use lots of different ways to write documentation. The whole point of putting it into a profile is that there is one, as far as FHIR goes, there is one point of truth, and it's computationally accessible. And there's only really two things that people are using for that, well, three things, I guess, that people are using that for the moment. One is to generate documentation, implementation guides. The second is to drive validation engines, and the third is to drive code generation, which is probably not that prolific over here in the UK at the moment, but it definitely is internationally. And to do that, it relies on the rules of how to create a good profile being in one computational place, and that in FHIR land is structure definitions. So the validation bit, so the implementation guidance documentation, clearly there's many different ways that can be created, and we could create it a multitude of ways. And if the intent was just to describe to people what to do, then there's no more benefit in putting that in the structure definition profile than there is putting it in just HTML or any other form for that matter. It's just written exchange so that people can do what they want with it. The value that we have at the moment is the ability to drive validation of that. Now, you can debate whether we need that, and that's a different question, but if the answer to whether we need it or not is yes, then the only way to achieve that today is to use the tools that are available today to drive our structure definitions. Now, tomorrow, that might be a different world. In the future, that might be a different world. But if you're talking about things that are going to be realized in the next 6 to 12 months, then probably that's the only thing that's attainable. So the other thing which FHIR profiles are not meant to be, they're not to be clinical knowledge tools, they're not to be the source of clinical knowledge, they're not intended to represent, the definition of all things clinical. They're only meant to define the things that are required for the purposes of FHIR, which we'll come to a moment. And I think, you know, when it comes to all the things that you need to know about an observation, they're not all necessarily going to be in a profile. You know, so the informatics part of it all as to, you know, what units you use and what values you use and maybe reference ranges and things like that, then they may be in the profile, but other clinical things as to how you would take that, you know, observation and clinical practice, all that kind of stuff, they're of course never going to be in the profile. But it's only ever going to be a partial view of, you know, the total knowledge about what a observation is, how observation is made, and what its purpose is. So, other things which are kind of hopefully obvious. So, FHIR is predominantly a standard for exchanging data, and the FHIR community will say safely, and safely is itself subjective. You know, but what we're trying to say is that it can do it in a rigorous manner. It can do it in a manner where there is some degree of assurance that the information that was meant to be exchanged was exchanged, and both the sending and receiving parties have honoured their, in IT terms, contractual obligations of doing that. That's what it sets out to do, and that's why everything in FHIR, every last thing it does, is built in computational formats. You know, that's why value sets are computational, and that's why structured definitions are computational, because it's all meant to be able to be processed by engines to allow things to be tested and validated and have reuse. It is not a standard for data persistence. It's not meant to be a definition of how you store data. It's meant to be a definition of how you exchange data. And there's clearly going to be overlaps on that, you know, and there's clearly an overlap with OpenAIRE, which, you know, is about persistence, maybe not exclusively about persistence, but definitely majors on persistence, and there's clearly always going to be a tension there as to, you know, which is the prominent thing, and that's again going to be a matter of perspective. So I'm kind of repeating myself here. I think one of the things which, when it comes on to not whether you profile observations, but how you profile observations, which I haven't really explored in a whole lot of detail today, but it will come up as we get to more use cases, is we have to consider that when we create a profile, so we define how we're going to use how we're going to define the information in a particular type of observation, and how we're going to use SNOMED in that observation, or predominantly SNOMED, because that will be the predominant coding system. You know, then we have to make sure that it can work in all the different paradigms that we have in FHIR. So it might be that the initial use case is to say how we're going to do an observation in a message, or how we're going to do an observation in a document. But these things will move around, you know, so what we're seeing, for example, in child health is things might start off as a message as they're moved and as they come in, say, potentially via an event, but then they will be disseminated once again as a message. They might be queried by a RESTful interface. They might be queried by a RESTful interface that results in the response to that query being a document. So all this stuff is to be worked out, but we can't lose sight of the fact that observations have to work across all the different paradigms. And the pertinent part about that is, in messages and documents, the recipient is just given it, you know, so here it is, here's the message and here's all the content that I'm giving you, and in there will be some observations, and you should have some degree of expectation of what type of observations are, and you can work it out yourself. And the same would really go for documents. But in a RESTful scenario, you pretty much have to go and ask for the observations. So you're going to go and say, give me an observation of a certain type. You know, and there's different ways that you can do that in FHIR, but we need to make sure that when we define the observations, that it allows itself to be queried. And I'm not going to go into that because we'll go into that in later sessions, but I think we just need to be mindful that when someone goes and queries something, it has to be predictable how they're going to query that. So you can go and say, so you could just say, give me all the observations for a given patient, and in many scenarios you'd end up with a lot of observations. Or you could say, go and give me the observations of type X, and that'd be fine, but then only if, if all, I don't know, if all body weights had the same SNOMED code, you could do that, but maybe there's different types of body weight, so maybe there's a different types of SNOMED codes. So you could go and query, say, give me all the codes that are X, Y, or Z, or you could say, go and give me all observations where the code is within this value set. There's different options that are possible. We need to explore those when those use cases come up. But we have to be mindful of it's not just a code which is an observation and it's given to someone. It has to be predictable enough that people can go and query against it. And I know there's been some discussion around the child health as to whether all the coding in that area satisfies that condition. But once again, as and when the use cases get explored on the query side of things, we'll test that. So, profiling. So there is an argument to say that actually you don't need, in FHIR you can get away, well, if you were really, really blasé about it, you could get away with no profiles at all. But you can definitely get away with very minimal profiling. So you could argue that in Care Connect, you could have a profile which basically just had some slicing to put into some SNOMED identifiers and maybe some slicing to put in some UCOM identifiers, and pretty much not much more than that. Because actually we could say it is a general purpose utility observation, and you can do whatever you need to do. And that would be fine, and that every observation that you could ever dream of would probably fit into that model. And that's fine as long as I say that one is that there is no need for validation, because you would not be able to validate it other than to say it was structurally valid. You could not validate that the content was valid. And we'll kind of come round to this discussion on validation over and over again, because I know there has been some discussions regarding validation in various projects going on at the moment. And what we have to understand is validation is not about the centre saying a system is good or not. No, validation and testing is something that happens in the whole development pipeline. So, when it comes to the developers who are developing a system, they will want to test that what they're doing is correct. They'll want to build into their sort of continuous development processes, that as they release and iterate through their development, that they release and iterate through various test scenarios. And they'll want testing to be able to do that. When you get to the later system tests and integration tests and acceptance tests, things are going to want to be tested to make sure that people who have built it, the people who have built it want to test their own things to make sure they're of quality. And we could let every developer go off and do that by themselves, or we could provide some frameworks to allow people to reuse that and save money in the longer run. When a purchaser goes to buy a system, and they're going to say, and I've got 3 different people out there all saying a system, all claiming to have implemented the same set of specifications, how do I know that they have? How do I know that they've implemented right? How do I know I'm going to buy the one that's of value and quality? And once again, they will want some kind of testing to be performed on that. Now, once again, not saying that would be a thing that Ansys Digital necessarily need to do. If you think like IHE and how they certify, maybe that model, or maybe some independent body that certifies things. But people buying things will want some level of assurance that the thing that they're buying works. And all this boils down to having some degree, and it's questionable as to whether that's a lot or a little, ability to validate what has been created. For national systems, for things which hit NHS Digital, for example, if we as an organisation store data, if we hold master repositories of things, we absolutely will validate, because we have to protect the content of that repository, and we have to make sure that things are as good as possible when they land in that repository. So we will be driven as an organisation for things which are national to validate things. And at this point in time, the way and tools that we have to do that is going to be driven off profiles. Now, all of this is about today. It's not about tomorrow. Maybe there are other ways that we can do validation in tomorrow, but at the moment they seem to be largely aspirational and largely untested and validated, they're kind of in the idea category, but we'll touch a little bit more on that a bit later on. On the other side of things, even though we say all the rules for how to create, say, a blood pressure observation, or a height, or a weight, or a BMI, or a sodium level, or whatever it is, then we could argue that as long as there's vigorous documentation as to how to create an observation of that type and what the different properties of that are, is documented well, then that may be enough. But that's all going to rely on that documentation being easily accessible, understandable, who's going to curate that content, who's going to agree that content, how is it going to be versioned, so if you do a version 1, so if you think about, for example, Stonebridge cycles, on the premise that most of this will be Stonebridge encoded, then how is that going to change between Stonebridge releases? If a system's been built on a certain version, does it impact if the documentation changes? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. All this stuff needs to be worked out and tested. So that whichever way we go on this, there's quite a lot of work that's going to have to be done to validate whatever our chosen processes are, our chosen methodologies are, to make sure that they're workable, scalable, and stand the test of time. So, a bit more about validation. So, there will almost certainly be different views between local and national systems as to the level of validation required. So if you're building a system within a hospital, for example, and you're in complete control of it, you may take a different view on the level of validation required. You may take a view that actually I know this set of profiles I use is for an interface which is only ever going to be used by one front end, and that front end system has got really, really good validation, so I trust the validation in that system, so I don't need to put the validation into the profiles, because actually it's too late, because by the time you use the profiles, the data has already been input, so what's the point of validating it, because you've got what you've got. And that may well be the case. But as I say, for national stuff, most of the national data will come through APIs and not be front-ended by any kind of user interface or any kind of system. And most of the systems in the national space will have many, many different interfaces at the front end of it all, many of which are not in our control. So the only way that we can protect things is to put the validation into the APIs, i.e. into the profiles, and do it that way. Validation is more likely to be used and have more value at the point where you create data, not at the point where you're simply shipping data around. So, if you have an API to create a blood pressure entry into a system, or to create a body weight entry or whatever it is, then there's more requirement, there's more value in having validation there than it is, say, for example, just sharing data between EHRs. Because by the time you get to share data between EHRs, the data is what the data is. So, if something doesn't comply to a profile, what are you going to do about it? So you're probably going to be more relaxed on that scenario than where the data is actually being created, where you would hope to have some ways of implying some form of better data quality. So what we got here? I think the degree of validation that is going to be required on that scale of none at all to very rigorous is going to be use case specific. It's going to be based on the systems that are being designed, and it's going to be based on their ability to, or what their desired outcomes are. It's going to be based on what the capabilities at that point in time are. So as I keep on saying, at the moment, if there is a requirement to do validation, the only technology at the moment in the world of FHIR that can apply validation to instances of FHIR is via profile validation. Now, that might not be the same tomorrow, and other things might appear, other capabilities might appear, in which case, as each project goes along, that can be reassessed as a way to go forward. And that's it on that slide. So if we get onto what is an observation, so in FHIR observation is quite a broad thing. Clearly, it can be used for many, many different things, and I think on that basis it's going to be unlikely that we will come up with one pattern of doing observations that satisfies everything, because I think if we had one pattern of doing an observation that satisfies everything, it would be the observation as defined by FHIR. So because I don't think you can get any more generic than the one that's kind of off the shelf. So I think what we'll have is a number of different usage patterns of observations, and and I'm going to go through a few that I've come up with. I'm not saying these are the definitive list; they're kind of just ones I've thought about. But I think as a community, we probably need to think about, and synthesize out of that whole collection of different observations that there are out there, what are the common patterns. I think as we go through that journey, then we need to think about what can we do now. So we have a number of projects which are in flight or imminent, and whatever we do on those, we have to make decisions now or very soon about those. And then we can think about what would we aspire to do in the longer term, and what would we need to do to test and validate those approaches. But what we can't do is not to do anything today because we're dreaming of a better way to do it tomorrow, because we have to deliver stuff now. So I think it's going to be a mixed economy for a little while, or maybe even quite a while. So a number of patterns, and these are patterns which some of the ones that we've kind of seen in systems today, or when I've kind of been looking around at how other people are doing observations, looking on the various different platforms that people put their FHIR observations on, different countries are doing, and on different projects are doing. Even I was looking recently on the OpenAir CKM sites and see how have they modelled observations, and there isn't any across all of that. There isn't much consistency. Everyone's doing it broadly different ways, and certainly on the FHIR side of things, that's mainly because everyone's probably at the start of a journey, and as I said before, either they haven't got widespread national implementations in place, or they've just targeted very localized systems. So you may say there's a FHIR project, I don't know, in one part of the country or one part of the world, that's maybe just looking at some very, very specific observations to support an application or a smart app or something like that, which is just doing a very, very constrained set of things, and therefore they only need a very, very constrained set of profiles. I think when we try and say what's everything going to be, and how is it going to work across a complete country, across every single system that ever is going to use an observation, it becomes quite a challenge. So a number of different things I want to sort of call out. So one is some of the observations that we already use within NHS Digital, prior to the Care Connect days, are for non-clinical things. So if we pop back here, you will see on the, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it says demographic observation, so we can even capture demographic characteristics. So in spine, we have some things which are notionally demographics, but are not part of the PDS record. And they're kind of being add-ons. And they're add-ons for a number of different reasons, predominantly because they're not part of the core demographic record, and because we haven't got a FHIR version of a core demographic record in NHS Digital as yet, that they were done a slightly different way. So we have a couple of observations which are in use, which are really attributes of demographic. We don't think there's going to be many of these, and there's certainly not going to be hundreds of these in our world, but they are few. Because of the nature of them, they possibly will not always use SNOMED, because some of the things maybe don't lend themselves to SNOMED. So there's a few out there already, and there's a few in the wild, so to speak. But I think they're going to be an edge case. So I've called these things multi-component observations. It's probably just a made-up name by myself. But if you think back to how we used to do things in V3, and we think back to how I look around other people around the world, how they're doing observations, they have chosen, it's not to say that that's how it would land in this country. They'd go through a design curation process as and when they came in, but sometimes you get observations which are about more than one data point. So certain those, like a blood pressure might be a systolic and a diastolic. APGAR score might be the component parts of an APGAR score as components of a larger observation. There's different ways that can be done. I'm not saying that's how it would be done, but sometimes observations are more than just a single data point. And we'd need to think about if we were at a point where we were going to do single generic observations, how we would then describe the component parts of the observation. So, the model may work if we just had systolic blood pressure, if we just had diastolic blood pressure, but if we had a compound blood pressure, which is a combination of the two, and maybe, I can't remember what it is, Kirchhoff's third echo or whatever it was that was in the so-called archetype before, and a number of other things, how do these all come together? It's a different pattern there from just having that single data point observation. Extended observation. So as you'll be aware, in FHIR we have this concept of extensions, and it may well be the case, I don't think we've got any use cases at the moment, but it may well be the case that we need to extend the observation resource to fully describe the extensions that we need. So this came up as I was browsing around some of the repositories that other people have their profiles on, and when I say that, it's mainly the simplifier repository, and some people are putting extensions into. Sorry? Hello? Okay, sorry.
No, carry on.
Yeah, sorry. So some observations that I can see around the world have found the need to put extensions into their observations. Now, just because they did doesn't mean that we will. Just because their observations, their observations are based on their use cases, ours we build on our use cases. But if we had a generic observation resource, then it would struggle to cater for the observations. So I'll put a link in on that slide there, and this is off the FHIR website, which basically goes through some examples of some genomics observations and how they use extensions. I'm not suggesting that we use their profiles. I'm not suggesting that's how we would do genomics. What I am saying is that it may be the case that as we go and do more specialized different types of observations, we may need to start using extensions. And if we only had a simple profile, how would that work? So I don't get what I call common observations, and I take from either. There is no such thing as a simple observation. There's no such. But what we are doing at the moment, so and I guess this is kind of maybe the approach that DCH used, and EMEA, well, actually the Inter-Open community be aware because of the new work commissions that have been socialised from NHS England. Excuse me. One of the projects coming through is what they're calling their observations, common observations. I can't remember the exact title for it all. And there's a discussion going on as to what the exact scope of that is, whether it's based around news or News 2 or whatever it is. But there is a desire from NHS England to have a set of common, inverted commas, profiles for things that I use more frequently. How that's arrived at, I do not know, and that's someone else's challenge as to how we identify what those common used observations are. But that's coming through now, and so I think when people get back after their summer holidays and breaks, that'll be the project which, as NHS Digital, we're certainly going to be tasked to deliver against. So what seems to be the ask from NHS England at the moment is that we create a set of profiles against whatever are deemed to be these high value common observations. I don't know where you would draw the line. I don't know how you would go from identifying, is it the top 10 or the top 20 or top 50 or top 100 observations? I really don't know. But the ask seems to call out a set of specific profiles. Well, that's a typo at the bottom, I should say vital signs. So that's potentially another different pattern. And then we get the generic observation, which is the everything else. It's clearly, well, I say it's clearly, in my mind, it's clearly the case that you could not create a profile for every single observation that there will ever be. That would be madness. You know, so certainly in the land of pathology, you know, where you're going to get lots and lots of different types of pathology results, I don't think anyone, I've not come across anyone, you know, on my sort of glances around the world that proposing to do that. No one is trying to create a profile for sodium level and creatine level and lithium levels and all that, and that just doesn't make sense. And this is an area where people are beginning to explore, and I think they're quite immature explorations at the moment, but they are trying to explore how you may use some computable knowledge repository to validate against, so that you don't have to create all these different profiles. You know, so there is, I think, in fact, a very, very immature observation definition resource out there, and it's beginning to think around that. It may have synergies with some of the work in yesteryear. We were thinking of doing energy digital around a product called NLMC. It may have a product of other areas, which maybe Jay Kohler can speak to a little later on, if I don't know if he's on the call. That might be happening in the diagnostic area, but it doesn't exist today. You know, so whatever that, no, one, if such a thing ever arrives, and what it is and how it's governed and how it's rolled out and what the breadth of the content of such a system might be is totally unknown at this point in time. You know, as far as I'm aware, there are no plans in place with actual delivery dates for this to become a real thing. And then even if it did, then that would require changes to the validation machinery that exists to make use of it. So all of that is technically very possible, but I say I'm not aware of any actual plans to make that happen. And then how would that roll out across the system? So, you know, if you were an acute hospital, then yeah, maybe you could, you know, have an instance of that. Maybe you could access a national one. Maybe that's how it would work. If you were writing an app on a smartphone or some other kind of device, would it still scale? Would it still work in that environment? Don't know. So I think that there's an awful lot of thinking as to how that would move away from just being an idea to something which is well architected, deployed, scalable. And I think that's probably got its own journey to go on. So I think, you know, to summary of all that, I think, you know, if we get away from the earlier use cases I went through, with a question mark around the common ones and whether there will ever be any common ones, then a generic observation for the others probably makes sense. You know, so if you think back, for those of you who are around, how we used to do things back in the V3 days, that's kind of what we did. You know, so we back there we had things called templates as opposed to observations, and we had some observation templates for the inverted commas common things like body weight and BMI and height and blood pressure and things like that. But then we just had a generic observation for everything else. And how things popped into not being everything else to being very specific templates for them was on a use case basis. You know, as it came along and said, actually, for this one, we need to say more. On this one, we need to be more specific. And that was premised on use cases coming out of the programs that, you know, caused those to be created. So, how to decide? I said before, I think the only way that we can do this is to try some ideas, evaluate those, and get feedback, you know, and get feedback from the people implementing them. You know, so that's really going to require us to take particular note when we do first types and when we engage. And I say we, it's not just NHS Digital, it's other people out there who implement them as well. But we take particular regard in those implementations how we assess the impact of profiles and whether we're doing it in an optimal way, and get that feedback in so that we can evolve our thinking. I think where we are in the centre, and where we are in the different projects which are potentially going to use observations, then the implementation feedback, in all reality, is probably some time away. At least 6 months away. By the time systems get created, specified and then built, and we start to get feedback of first type and start to get some kind of volume of feedback, I think it's probably just some time away, because implementation does take a time. But hopefully other people out there who are doing things maybe locally, or on things which have faster delivery times, can also feed back into the process so they can share their learning on that as well. If we begin to explore how we could do other types of profiling, maybe we do propose to build some knowledge system that's computable. Maybe we do choose to look at providing some different validation capabilities, or at least exploring how they could be used and testing how they can be used. So certainly as far as NHS Digital goes, then clearly they need to be funded, So and I know everyone else kind of looks at NHS Digital saying, well, how can we fund things? But we ourselves need to work out how we fund ourselves, which will cause, us to explore within our organisation as to what would stimulate that to happen. And ultimately, it would come out of a programme, and ultimately that would mean that we'd have to be directed to do that by an SRO or a commission from NHS England. That's probably the only way it's going to happen, unless it can be sort of attached to an existing programme of work and built in that way, and potentially we can use that, as I'll show in a moment. So I think when we go through the observation profile, and we should always have in our mind is what's the minimum that we need to do. I think sometimes there's a tendency to over-profile things. Just because you can profile in it doesn't mean you need to profile it. If we're asserting that profiling, documentation is documentation, and there's a million ways to do that. But if we're saying the value of putting things in rules into profiles is validation, then we need to say, well, what are the things that we actually need to validate? So I think there is a tendency sometimes to over-profile things and over-tie things down and make things a little bit too inflexible. So I think that's something that we need to have in our minds as we go through profiling these going forward. So near-term decisions, I'm not saying these are decisions, I'm saying these are decisions that we should look to get. We can absolutely create a general purpose clinical profile of observations, and we can slice it for SNOMED and Newcomb and whatever else we think are generalized things that we would want to put into a utility profile. So at least people can begin to use those, and it's available for people to start using and provide feedback upon. If specific profiles are deemed necessary, and at the moment, the only reason I can think that they would be to suit validation, and that would be dependent on each program that's coming forward as to what their specific requirements are, then we shouldn't do what we have done. So at the moment, we have created things like head circumference, a digital child health head circumference. Well, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing special about a digital child health head circumference than there is about any observation which is a head circumference. So we shouldn't lock these away as level 3 observations, in my opinion. We should find a way of making them not project specific. So whether they become level 2 profiles in the inter-open world or not, then that might, in my opinion, sounds a sensible thing, but clearly other people may have views. But we definitely, if we think something has the possibility of reuse outside a specific system, then we should advertise it as such. so we talked about the Common Profiles New Work Commission. So what I am aware of that New Work Commission is, so I think Amir, I think you're involved in some discussions at the moment as to the exact scope of that, and maybe the approach that's being used on that. But what I am aware of is whatever is decided on the scope, they're going to want something relatively quickly, or even not relatively quickly, very quickly. So when we discuss with our stakeholders the approach on that, it may be the case that we have to go through a phased approach, and maybe we say, well, actually, this is what we can do quickly while we learn and while we do others. But in discussion on that program, for example, the commitment I have to that program is that we will kind of have an options paper. We'll say, you could do this, pros and cons, you could do this, pros and cons, and then the program will decide, because the program has to make those choices. So pathology observations, so there is a pathology project going to come along, and in that pathology project, clearly it's going to cater for a very large number of observations. So every pathology system I've ever seen, now whether it's in V3 or whether it's in FHIR, and that many in FHIR to be fair, only ever profiles observations in a generic way. It doesn't try and create all the different observations, but it may be that that project is an opportunity for leveraging or creating or experimenting with some kind of knowledge tool, so that we can kind of see whether that's something that might work in that area. I think probably the only way in the near future that we're going to be able to experiment with these different things is to attach it to a program of work that's already in flight. And the last thing I kind of wanted to say on this is, it may not be obvious, but in the world of FHIR, actually you can use multiple profiles and things. So if you had an observation might have multiple profiles associated with it. It doesn't have to be one. So to date, we've typically only used one profile per instance of anything, but an instance can declare conformance to multiple profiles. So it may be that we get to the point where we say, here's a generic observation profile, which most things, all things conform to, but in certain cases we put a second profile in and say, and this one then further asserts to this more specific thing as well. So that might give us a mixed mode of operation. Just thinking, it might be the case, for example, that we say, here is a generic observation, but it might be the case, I don't know, OpenAir say, and here's a profile that maps to a specific OpenAir archetype. And so you can layer these things on top of each other. So I think that's another area which is probably worth exploring in due course. And that was it. So I don't have any conclusions out of that. That was just my thoughts. So
thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for summarising the complex theme that was illustrated on RIVA. We've got 10 minutes. At most, unless people want to carry on. So are there any questions that people have? If you could raise your hands on the tool, we could do some questions, and I will unmute the person with a question if there are any. Any questions at all? You have to raise your hand because I've muted everybody. Okay, so I am going to Andrew Perry, first question.
Hi, Richard. Did feel like you changed tack towards the very end, and I had a whole lot of questions kind of around these very specific profiles which you kind of seem to be heading towards, and then actually kind of seem to kind of right towards the end and admit that actually this was very difficult and we should just be very generic, which is slightly where we were going, and kind of So in the earlier stuff, there were kind of all sorts of questions I had around if you have a weight profile that, and you did mention kind of the profiles are probably nearly more useful as a data input tool, the thing we need to kind of remember is that actually we have a huge amount of legacy data in in general practice and kind of and some in secondary care. So what would happen to kind of records that don't match that profile, kind of and things that so where Child Health chose 2 weight concepts or 2 weight codes, and actually SNOMED has 10 or 15 weight codes that are actually valid. What happens to that sort of stuff? So I mean, I think we ended up in a far better place than we started, and I think your last slide was a good place to work forward from. Was sort of one set of comments, and the other was sort of a slight cautionary kind of note. You seem to be saying that we need to test this all by implementation, and actually I think the interopen process works quite well in that it's kind of it is pre-implementation feedback. Because the problem sort of getting as far as doing an implementation, if you go to one system, one closed kind of communication environment, and they say, yeah, this works really well for us, and you widen it up and you say, well, this is the profile that kind of has been agreed by, a pilot site, pilot project, and kind of a very closed community. This is what we're going to, have as our standard. We end up kind of trying to pull other people in who just say, sorry guys, we can't do that. So I caution against kind of using, going too far down the line kind of before we get the feedback. And I think interopen was actually quite a, well, not quite a, interopen is a fantastic opportunity to get input from suppliers to kind of get pre-implementation feedback and standard set.
Thank you, Andrew. Richard, would you like to respond?
I mean, I think I agree. So I think the only thing I would say on the implementation side, I mean, there's 2 aspects of this. So you learn through implementation on various methodologies and approaches as to how you're going to profile things, because whatever hypothesis that we come up with in the interopen community has to be real, has to be attainable, and I think sometimes, I'm not saying it is in interopen, but I know it is in other communities, where people kind of start coming up with things which are not attainable, and and then they'll hypothesize and dream about the world of tomorrow where all these things are possible, and they're just not. So I think that there has to be a leveling in reality as to we're doing this to implement systems today. So what are the things that we can do today, and what are the things that we can aspire to tomorrow? And it's only really sensible to aspire to things of tomorrow if we have plans to make them real, because otherwise there'll always be tomorrow's aspirations. And then the second point is really on the actual individual profile. So I'm not for a moment saying that we would go to any locality or any project and say, give me what your profile of whatever is, because I think that should always be a community thing. So we wouldn't go to one locality and say, give me what your profile of blood pressure is, or give me what your profile of whatever is, because that we would hope would always be a community authored thing.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Ian McNichol now.
Hi. Richard, thanks. That was really good. I think it was a very good overview. This reiterates a little bit what I've been saying in the write-up, but so it's not really a question. It's more a statement. I think a few principles that we've kind of learned from doing a lot of observation archetypes over the years, that things tend to be more complex as you get more requirements from different communities. What seems like a simple observation ends up being more complex. The patterns are infinite. I mean, they're clearly not literally infinite, but there are a hell of a lot more patterns than you ever anticipate, and you picked up on that with the genomic stuff. These are just realities. I think the other thing is that very often local or community of purpose will actually have much more detailed and firmed up requirements. Like, I think the DCH is a really good example of what seems like, why do you guys need validation? Why do you need this, level of profiling? Well, that's what they need, because they've got their act together, they've got some real use cases, and therefore their needs are actually much more concrete. When we're working at kind of national standards level, with the other Care Connect stuff, it's a bit more woolly, because we're working with a large number of vendors and a large number of people who are at different levels of maturity. What I'm saying is that we will get continual requirements from quite local, maybe local and geographically, but more likely local care groups or care teams like DCH who need and will want to pump out quite detailed profiles, and the challenge is how and when to get these into from level 3 up to level 2. Of course, I'm going to come back and say, look, we have an awful lot of observations that I think could be picked up very readily and used, converted to FHIR profiles with the addition of the appropriate SNOMED codes. So let's use what's been done already, because we've covered, certainly covered all the vital signs space, an awful lot of the other signs and scores. So, the open air community in the UK is very happy, would be very keen to get involved. But yeah, thank you.
So I did look at the CKM stuff, and I think I looked at the Aperta one. But they all kind of synchronize with each other, don't they? So, then, and I think there was something like 170 and 180 observations in that particular one. And from my admittedly quite casual analysis of it, there seemed to be a mixture of very generic observations and really quite specific observations. And I think that's just going to be a challenge as we go forward as to how we organise these things, and it's definitely not easy.
Yeah, just to speak to that. So I completely agree. We've got exactly the same challenge, and we've taken the same approach that you're suggesting around pathology testing. That's going to work off some very generic patterns, most of it. Then when you get into radiology or imaging, it's quite tricky, because at the moment most of the messaging is very generic. But when you look at what people actually want to record, it becomes very detailed. So I think that's where there's going to be an awful lot of extensions. That's how we see things going.
Okay,
in other places, very concrete models. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, it's okay, because the other thing I was going to mention, which I didn't really pull out in the slide deck, was the whole area of reference ranges, and whether reference ranges should be part of the challenge or not.
I'm going to park that one for the moment.
Yeah.
Richard, if we can, just to bring other people in. So Jeremy, you've put something on the chat. Do you have enough voice to? I think some of your points were similar to Andrew, but do you want to try?
Yeah, I may go to a coffee visit anyway. Yeah, I've got sort of one question I still don't quite understand, and one sort of observation. So the question, which I guess is it seems odd to me that everybody seems to accept that there will be many, many observables for which no dedicated profile can exist. You just don't have the resources. It's inconceivable due to the sheer scale. Seems to be the argument as to why that's not going to happen. So I'm still left wondering if the majority, numerically, of observables will have to be passed by a dedicated profile. What is so special about those that cannot? Are they choosing to have more specific profiles just because they've got the time and the energy to build them? Or are they choosing to do it because they cannot survive without them? Because if it's the former, I think that's a misguided approach. If it's the latter, that there is genuinely some level of validation which they cannot achieve by any other method, unit conversion, whatever. They cannot conceive of a way where you could achieve more ubiquitous, validation of the unit of measure you send in birth weight in than using a FHIR profile, and that they believe that will always be true. Then okay, fine. But I don't understand how these two views can coexist without any rational explanation.
Thank Thank you, Jim. Richard.
Yeah, so I think one is probably a view of what's sustainable now, and one is probably a view of what's sustainable in the future. So if it is the case, and there's a quote only if, then that a given program, a given system needs to assure itself that the observations are as they deem fit, and they are using the right SNOMED codes, and they are using the right units of measure, and maybe there's other properties of the observation that they think are really important and need to be tested about. The only way to do that at this point in time that can be scaled is to put them in profiles. That
but
might
it can't
not
be scaled because it won't scale to doing it generically across the whole.
No. So at this point in time,
everybody chooses to put, if people choose to do the quick and dirty route and put off doing the principles, that's back to my second point really, which is that if we go with this do it fast, and break things approach, and we sort of hope that we will find out which of those approaches don't scale or just don't provide sufficient ubiquitous interoperability by having enough of them to find that out. My worry is that you have to have quite a lot of quote first of types before you start to understand where they can't talk to each other. And if all the first of types to start with are all basically mandarins in the center wanting to establish unidirectional data flows, which are then balkanized and islandized, they don't normally talk to each other and exchange data, they're not going to find out that by bundling everything into FHIR, because it's easier and quicker to do that they can't, that approach will bog everything else down, I think. So my worry is that this sort of leading from behind approach really, of not standing up to them and saying this is not going to scale. It might be quick, but it will be a hell of a pain to unpick when you realize you can't do what you really needed to do.
Yeah, and I think if I summarize, so I see the second point you wrote, Jeremy, is on the thread was, how many, I think your point is, how many trials and errors do we need to have to understand this issue, but there may not be many first of types to give us that kind of feedback. By the time they're implemented, it's too late to unpick it.
Yeah, and I think that I sense under this that there is enormous political desire from those who want to re-establish these unidirectional data flows, reporting data sets to the center, to do it quickly and therefore do it badly, basically, because the principal solution isn't there. That is true. And if they're going to be stopped from creating a pregnancy problem for everybody else, then you need something with some significant clout to stand on their hosepipe. And that is potentially one of the roles of the Care Connect process. But if we,
Thank you. Richard, do you have any thoughts? Chris, I know you're next, and Ian, I will bring you back in after Chris. Richard, do you have any?
I mean, I do understand that the short-term desires of some of the programs are not scalable, and I do understand that in due course to scale this to every observation across every system, it's going to take a different way of thinking. But we exist in a system that is built around what we can do now, so which is why I said we have to deliver what we have to deliver now, but in parallel, then we need to think about how we can do things in a more sustainable way. We cannot not do the things that we require now and not give them the benefits they want now in, promising a thing of tomorrow, because there are no plans in place to do anything else but this.
Okay.
Who's going to do it?
Well, for as long as we let them carry on doing it badly, then nobody will do it.
When we say let them, who's them?
Well, DCH, all that crowd. The way that data has been flowed to the centre historically doesn't fit well with the clinical process at the end. My worry would be that this particular way of doing FHIR and of using FHIR to re-instantiate the old data dictionary sort of flows, data set flows, will make it much harder to do the clinician-to-clinician flows. So, yes, the current people who are leaning very hard on doing it quick and dirty are not the clinicians. not the things that would support direct patient care. And my concern is that, you know, giving them, saying yes, we have to do what you've asked for, and we don't have the option to say no on the grounds that this is not scalable, or it will actually make somebody else's life very much harder or even impossible. That's a situation I think we're in. So if we say we can't say no, we can't not give them the benefits they want now, we have to be aware that in agreeing to go along with their unscalable solution, we are probably making it much harder to solve somebody else's problem at the same time.
I think this is the real issue and why this thread was very topical. I'm not expecting you to have the solution to that challenge, Richard. I know it's difficult, but I think this is the process of airing it. If you do, did you want to come back in, or should I?
No, I mean, there's nothing more I can say than what I've already said. That's
fine. Thank you very much, Jeremy. We've got Chris next, then Ian, then Pete Salisbury. Richard, are you still able to stay on?
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. Thank you. Chris Dixon, please.
Hi, I'd just like to come on back on that last point in terms of a specific program from a child health perspective is being driven by direct care and clinicians wanting this data to flow. So although some of the data that is have been agreed in that interoperability space looks and feels to support that secondary data usage, it is actually being used for direct care as well. So it is supporting a multitude of recipients on that front. But I think that the thing I'd like to pick up on really is in terms of what we're being told at a program level by our technical colleagues is that from the digital interoperability platform perspective, they will be doing quite lightweight validation. So the validation that we've been talking about on this call this morning, that level of validation is not in the plan. So yes, they're going to check that if there's a code there, it's a valid code, i.e. it's a SNOMED code, if that's what it's supposed to be, but it's not going to look any further than that. And it's going to look from an NHS number perspective to see if it's a valid NHS number, and that's about it. Because the level of validation that we're talking about on this call is not centrally viable in the technology that we're planning to put in place at that platform level. So the issue around validation in this message sharing interoperability pattern that we're talking about is just not going to be provided at the centre. So I'm not sure that's a strong argument in terms of where we go with the profiling.
I think it's where the validation is applied. So it's very rarely the case that people run validation processes in operational systems because it's too onerous, it's too resource intensive. But what we do run validation systems is against systems to allow them to interface into operational systems. So you would test them as part of a development process, part of their pre-go live processes. And that's when the validation would happen, not as they were operationally running.
I think it might be helpful to think of those as actually they're contractual. Now, part of that contract might be to support validation, but it's just as likely to support some kind of workflow. So it's a community agreeing that for this thing we'll use this code in these units, and we're going to lock that down quite tightly. One of the use cases is validation, but not everyone. I was just going to come in and say, yeah, completely, yeah, yeah.
Before, just allow Chris to finish.
Yeah, sorry, Chris, yeah, go.
So just two last.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, just two last points really in terms of, as a program perspective, we are quite time pressured in terms of we are going to get to implementation in February. And so in terms of we need to make a decision, and what I'm really keen on doing from a program perspective is ensuring that whatever decision we make, we don't make it, to pick up on Jeremy's point, we don't make it harder to unpick if we've decided it's not quite the right thing. We want to make the right decision. Just because we're going at pace, we don't want to make the wrong decision to make it more difficult in the future to unpick that. So we really want to be clear that whatever we decide, it needs to be to the best of choices we've got available to us, forwardly compatible.
And I think, obviously, we don't have many, well, this is a core curation team call. We'd want to share this, and I hope we will. I'll speak to Richard afterwards with the implementers on RIBA. We've recorded it, but I mean that was one of the reasons we brought this kind of stuff through the interopen curation process and get the feedback, as I think Andrew and Jeremy have mentioned. So Richard, did you want to come back to Chris before I go to some others?
No, not at this point in time.
Okay, and again, it's very helpful just to air some of these issues. So the next person is Ian. Can we just try and keep this short for everybody?
Yeah, sorry, I won't.
Other people who want to come in.
Yeah, I mean, of course there are time pressures, and this is the challenge. We're always going to have to say to people, just get on and do it. It won't be quite right. It will change, but it's how we can pick up those ideas that we think are relevant within DCH or any other program and get them through into level 2, and accept that at some point they'll just have to carry on doing it the wrong way for a while because there's just too much time. I think we also have to be a little bit more strategic. You know, the goal and the vision that you see expounded by those upstairs is very much about a very tightly integrated system where those kind of contractual rules will be very critical to parts of workflow. So just meeting the immediate needs, we're going to miss the boat. In 5 years' time, we'll still be having the same conversation. That's me.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Pete Salisbury, and then we've got Dave Barnett. Pete, if you unmute, I'll unmute you, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Pete.
I was just going to say that perhaps for some of the things that we've profiled for in DCH, we could actually push the, rather than have validation, just push it into the assurance and use the assurance to, because I think once people have started to export the things, they don't generally change. And the other thing I was going to say is that I know we've talked about observations, but it also is kind of a principle we need to apply to things like conditions and procedures as well.
Well, we kept those quite, well, I mean, the models for condition and procedures, we kept as generic as possible, mindful of ensuring that the GP problem model was catered for, but we didn't really go to a degree of profiling with that, Pete.
But if you look at the published profiles for conditions and procedures, there's also quite a lot that are tied down in a similar manner to the observation.
For GP Connect as a to fit GP Connect's use case, but at a generic level 2, we had to keep it open for the clinical needs as much as we could.
I'm not really talking about GP Connect. I'm talking about DCH and.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suspect we hadn't yet got to curating those bits fully. So that would have been part of that process to review that. So
I think we talked through some of them, but I think that obviously the discussion is centered around observation. But yeah, like I say, I think it should apply to those wider profiles too.
Yeah, and the plan for curation would be to do that. And I think as it stood, we were going to get Chris to come back with more definitive use cases on the ground about how this was going to how the data was going to be used for clinical care, and then pump that back through the curation process. Did you have a specific question for Richard on this, Pete?
There were just those two observations, really.
Okay. Richard, did you want to? Was there anything specific you want to reply to that?
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay. I've got Dave Barnett. So if you have a question, you've done your questions. Could you put your hands down, please? So Dave Barnett.
Yeah, sorry, I just got 3 points. So the first point is a reply to Chris's point in that I think what we're talking about here is a validation thing, really. So the actual instance that flows on the wire would be the same whether you use the profile or whether you use some documentation to say the shape of the profile. The only difference really is a bit of metadata that allows you to computably validate the instance. That's kind of my first point. Second point is we've talked about patterns in the past with observations, and no one's kind of raised that in this forum. So we talked about the code-only pattern and the key value pair patterns. And what we want to be careful of going forward is the rules around if I've got an observation to transmit from A to B, which pattern should I be using? So I think that's quite sort of an important point we need to consider going forward. And the third point about all this is the way we're developing at the moment. So take the example of newborn hearing as an observation, the outcome. That pattern and what's been transmitted before, the rules, is buried in the specification, so it's not readily available. If you're starting a new project and you also want to use newborn hearing outcome, it's not obvious where you will go to see what was done before for that particular observation. So maybe we should think about that as well. That's my 3 points.
Thank you. Thank you. Any response to that, Richard?
I think that's probably the last point is what I was saying before about, you know, whatever documentation we come up with, if that replaces having more specific profiles, it needs to be accessible. It needs to be you know, ubiquitously accessible, so that people can find it. And I think where that is, that's going to be a challenge, because as much as any organisation tries to advertise where the central everything is, not everyone will find it.